Welcome to the Playing Books podcast.
We are really going to dig into something transformative today, something that honestly could change how you cook forever.
Absolutely. We're looking at the core ideas from Samin Nosrat's incredible book, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, Mastering the Elements of Good Cooking hardcover.
And our mission for this podcast episode is basically to break down cooking, not into a million recipes, but into just 4 fundamental elements.
4 notes, as she calls them. It's this idea that if you understand these 4 things, salt, fat, acid, and heat, you can intuitively cook almost anything. You get that freedom in the kitchen.
Yeah, and the book gets huge praise. I mean, Jutta Modelangi, April Bloomfield, Heidi Swanson, Michael Pollan himself, they all rave about it. Ottolenghi called it a new generation culinary resource.
And Rebecca Skloot mentioned its clear science and how it guides you to maximum deliciousness. It's not just a cookbook. It's like a philosophy of flavor.
Totally. The promise is huge.
Yeah.
Master these elements, and you basically develop this instinct, this ability to improvise, like she says, like a jazz musician.
Which is so cool. And Samin's own journey is pretty fascinating too, right? She didn't start out aiming to be a chef.
Not at all. She was actually studying English Lit at UC Berkeley, thinking about a writing career.
But then she discovered Chez Panisse, Alice Waters' legendary restaurant.
And that just changed everything. It became her, well, her real education, you could say.
Yeah.
Her culinary university.
There's that amazing story about how she kind of accidentally became a teacher involving Michael Pollan.
Oh, yeah, the storied snack story. Right? She was auditing his food journalism class at Berkeley.
And the assignment was for students to bring in a snack each week, something with a story.
So naturally, Samin doesn't just bring, like, cookies, no.
She shows up with a full-on, made-from-scratch spinach lasagna, like a proper lasagna.
Served on actual plates.
Uh-huh.
With linens and silverware, things that had apparently never been seen in that classroom before.
Can you imagine? The other students must have been stunned.
Totally captivated. And it wasn't just the food, which was apparently incredible, but also her story about learning to make pasta dough by hand in Florence. Just wow.
And that moment, that lasagna, basically shifted her path. Pollan realized she wasn't just a student, she was a natural teacher. She started teaching him how to cook.
And breaking down these really complex cooking concepts into simple, memorable ideas, like that brilliant description of an emulsion.
Oh, I love that one. A temporary peace treaty between fat and water.
Exactly. It just makes it click, you know? That's the kind of clarity we're aiming for in this podcast today.
So structure-wise, we're going to tackle each of the 4 elements one by one. Dive deep into the science, the stories she tells, and crucially, how you can apply this stuff in your own kitchen.
Sounds good. Let's start where Samin starts, with salt.
Okay, salt, the flavor amplifier. I think most people just think, salt makes food salty. End of story.
Right. But Samin argues it's way more nuanced. Its main job, its primary role, is to amplify and deepen the flavors that are already there.
So it makes chicken taste more chickeny and tomatoes more tomatoey.
Precisely. In Chez Panisse, she learned that if a dish felt flat, if it was just kind of meh, the first thing they'd check was the salt. Always.
And salt didn't just mean table salt, right?
Yeah.
It could be other things.
Oh, absolutely. It could be salt crystals, sure. But also salty ingredients like grated Parmesan or pounded anchovies, olives, capers.
Yeah.
Anything that brought that saline quality.
Which connects to that constant Chez Panisse mantra she mentions, taste, taste, and then taste again.
You have to. It's about educating your palate, training your senses so you know what something needs. It develops that intuition, that jazz musician's ear for flavor.
And you brought up anchovies and Parmesan. That makes me think about umami. Is that connected here? Because umami isn't one of her 4 elements.
That's a really sharp point. It absolutely is connected. While umami isn't one of the core 4 notes, salt is often the delivery vehicle for it. Think about soy sauce, miso, those cured meats, aged cheeses.
They're salty and deeply savory.
Exactly. So when Samin talks about using Parmesan or anchovies for salt, she's implicitly teaching us that saltiness often comes packaged with umami, that 5th taste, which adds this incredible depth and satisfaction. It bridges simple saltiness with complex flavor.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's get into the science, because this is where things get kind of counterintuitive, especially with meat.
Yeah, the idea that salt makes meat moister.
Right, because everyone thinks salt draws water out. Like when you salt eggplant or cucumbers before cooking, why doesn't salting a steak early dry it out?
It's a great question, and it comes down to how salt interacts specifically with protein structures under heat. So think of protein and raw meat like a tightly wound coil or net.
Okay.
When you heat that protein, those coils tighten up. That's denaturation and coagulation. As they tighten, they physically squeeze out the water trapped inside the muscle fibers. That's what makes cooked meat dry and tough if you overdo it.
Makes sense. So where does salt come in?
Salt actually dissolves some of the protein strands near the surface before cooking. It turns them into a sort of gel. Yeah, and this gel structure physically gets in the way. It prevents the protein coils from tightening up quite so much when they're heated. Because they can't contract as intensely, they don't squeeze out as much water.
Ah, so the water stays inside the meat.
Exactly. The meat retains significantly more moisture, making it taste juicier and more tender. It literally gives you, as Samin puts it, a greater margin of error for overcooking.
That is a game changer. So a salted chicken breast can handle maybe an extra minute or two without becoming sawdust.
Precisely. Whereas an unsalted one, forget it. It goes from perfect to terrible very quickly.
So this science directly informs the practical strategy. Salt early, salt amply.
Definitely. She says it's almost always better than salting late or not at all. Ideally, you want to season meat the day before you plan to cook it.
And the timing depends on the cut.
Right. The bigger, denser, or tougher the cut, the more time the salt needs to penetrate. Think big roasts, oxtails, short ribs, they might need a full day, maybe even 2.
And for something really dense like a Thanksgiving turkey.
She recommends 2 or even 3 days in advance. That allows the salt to work its magic all the way through, tenderizing and seasoning deeply.
Okay, but what if you don't have a day or two? Like, you decide to make roast chicken tonight.
Great practical question. She has a fantastic tip for that. Instead of putting the salted meat straight back into the fridge, leave it on the counter for up to 2 hours after salting.
Why does that help?
Because cold temperatures slow down the salt's diffusion into the meat. Letting it sit at room temp for a bit gives the salt a head start, speeding up the seasoning process significantly before it goes back in the fridge or into the oven.
Clever. Okay, salt doesn't just affect meat. What about baking? She tells that story about the pizza dough.
Ah, yes, the giant stand mixer incident. She noticed that when salt was added late in the mixing process, the dough immediately tightened up and the big, powerful mixer actually started to strain.
Why would salt tighten dough?
Because salt has a significant effect on gluten. Gluten is the protein network that forms in doughs made from wheat flour, and it's what gives bread its structure and chewiness. Salt actually strengthens those gluten bonds, making the dough tighter and more elastic.
Okay, so sometimes you want that effect.
Exactly. If you're making something where chewiness is the goal, like ramen noodles or udon noodles, you add the salt early in the process to maximize that gluten development.
But for things like cakes or muffins.
You want tenderness, right? You want to inhibit gluten development. So for delicate batters like cakes, pancakes, or quick breads, you add the salt later, or sometimes use less overall to keep the texture soft and tender.
It's all about controlling texture. She even says to leave salt out of fresh Italian pasta dough entirely.
Yeah, because you rely on heavily salted boiling water to season the pasta as it cooks. Adding salt to the dough itself can make it too tough or rubbery.
Fascinating. Okay, let's talk salt types and measurement. This trips people up all the time.
Oh, massively. Samin really emphasizes that the shape and size of the salt crystal dramatically affect how salty it tastes by volume.
So like standard table salt.
That's made by rapid evaporation, creating tiny, dense cubic crystals. It packs tightly into a measuring spoon, so it's very salty for its volume.
Compared to, say, flaky salt.
Like Malden or Fleur de Sel. Those are often made using slower solar evaporation methods, resulting in larger, lighter, hollow flakes. They don't pack as densely.
So a tablespoon of table salt is much saltier than a tablespoon of kosher or flaky salt.
It can be 2 to 3 times saltier. That's why measuring salt by volume is so unreliable. You can easily oversalt or undersalt if you just swap types using the same spoon.
So what's the solution? Weigh it.
Weighing is definitely more accurate and consistent, especially in baking. But Samin's ultimate advice, the gold standard, is always salt to taste. Use the recipe as a starting point, but trust your palate.
She does give a shout out to one specific type, though, diamond crystal kosher salt.
Yes. She likes it because its flakes are lighter and dissolve more quickly than denser salts like Morton kosher or regular table salt.
Why is quick dissolving important?
It reduces the risk of tasting something, thinking it needs more salt only because the salt you already added hasn't fully dissolved yet. You add more, then 10 minutes later, bam! Saltpocalypse. Diamond crystal minimizes that risk, especially in quick cooking dishes.
Makes sense. Okay, this might seem weird, but Salt in dessert, isn't that counterintuitive?
You'd think so, but Samin argues passionately against that sweet-savory divide. Salt enhances all flavors, including sweetness and the subtle notes in baking ingredients.
The cookie dough experiment, tell us about that.
Right, she suggests making a batch of your favorite cookie dough, dividing it in half, and adding the normal amount of salt to one half, but omitting it completely from the other. Then bake both.
And the difference is noticeable.
Apparently, it's astounding. The unsalted cookies taste flat, one-dimensionally sweet, but the salted ones. Suddenly you taste the nuttiness of the flour, the caramel notes from the brown sugar, the richness of the butter and eggs.
So the salt isn't just cutting the sweetness.
No, it's acting like a spotlight, illuminating all the other flavors that were hiding in those seemingly bland background ingredients. It adds complexity.
And don't forget texture. She talks about using fine salt in the dough and flaky salt on top.
Yes. That textural contrast, that little crunch of flaky salt on a chocolate chip cookie or a caramel, it just elevates the whole experience.
Even the pros mess up sometimes, though. She shares some salt disaster stories from Chez Panisse.
Oh God, the lasagna incident. A cook forgot to salt the ricotta filling for 100 portions of lasagna.
100? What did they do?
Samin had the painstaking task of trying to salvage it. She had to carefully lift the layers of each individual portion and try to sneak tiny grains of salt between all 12 layers.
Oh, that sounds nightmarish.
It was. But the lesson was clear. You have to season from within. Just sprinkling salt on top of a complex layered dish after it's assembled just doesn't work. The seasoning needs to be integral.
So what about the opposite problem? Oversalting. We've all done it.
It happens. Her advice is pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Trying to balance it by serving something intentionally bland alongside it doesn't really fix the problem. Your palate still registers the oversalted component.
So you can't just serve plain rice with super salty stew and hope it averages out.
Not effectively. The only real fix for oversalting is dilution. You have to add more unsalted main ingredients to the dish itself. More broth, more vegetables like potatoes that can absorb some salt, more cream, more water, whatever makes sense for that dish to lower the overall salt concentration.
Got it. Dilute, don't just try to mask it. Okay, that covers salt pretty thoroughly. Where do we go next?
Next up is the element that carries all that flavor.
Fat.
Fat, okay. Often demonized, but absolutely essential in cooking. Samin breaks its role down into three main categories,
Yeah.
right? Exactly. Three distinct vital roles. First, fat can be a main ingredient itself, defining the flavor and texture. Think about the juiciness fat brings to a burger, or the tenderness and flakiness butter gives pastry, or the smoothness cream adds to ice cream.
Right. It's in the food.
Second, fat acts as a cooking medium. It's what you heat up in the pan to transfer heat efficiently for searing, sautéing, or frying. It helps create browning.
And third?
Third, fat is used as a seasoning or finishing touch. Think of drizzling really good olive oil over grilled fish or carpaccio, or adding a knob of butter to finish a sauce.
That finishing touch makes such a difference. Her big aha moment about fat's importance came from a tomato sauce contest.
Yeah, the legendary Chez Panisse tomato sauce cook-off. Everyone started with the exact same high-quality tomatoes, but the sauces tasted wildly different.
And the winner, was it some super complex recipe?
Not necessarily. The winter sauce was great, sure. But the key takeaway for Samin was that the fat used made the biggest difference.
How so?
She realized, fundamentally, that food can only ever be as delicious as the fat with which it's cooked. Cooking an onion in, say, amazing extra virgin olive oil versus cheap vegetable oil or even standard butter creates a completely different flavor foundation for the entire dish. The quality and type of fat dictate the ceiling of deliciousness.
That makes so much sense. And she really dives into how the type of fat creates regional flavors, especially with olive oil.
Oh yeah, her pilgrimage through Italy during the olive harvest, the raccolta.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant illustration of terroir in fat.
She found that oils from different regions taste totally different.
Completely. In hot, dry, hilly places like Tuscany, the olives produce oil that's spicy, peppery, almost pungent with a distinct bite.
Versus coastal areas.
Like Liguria. There, the climate is milder and the oil is much gentler, buttery, smooth, low in acidity.
So you wouldn't use a punchy Tuscan oil on everything.
Absolutely not. You'd totally overwhelm delicate things, like a raw fish tartare or a gentle vegetable dish. For that, you'd want the softer Ligurian oil. Choosing the right fat is like choosing the right seasoning. It has to match the other ingredients.
It's not just olive oil, though. She talks about using animal fats, too.
Definitely. Rendered animal fats are flavor powerhouses. Think about saving bacon grease or rendering chicken, duck, or goose fat. Strain it, keep it in the fridge, and then using that to fry potatoes or saute greens?
Oh, duck fat fries.
Exactly. The depth of flavor is just incredible. And she mentions how in regions where pork isn't common, things like lamb suet are essential for making flavorful sausages, like merguez.
Okay, let's switch gears slightly to texture. How does fat create crispness?
Right, crispness. This really ties fat and heat together. Fat is the key to achieving good browning, the Maillard reaction and caramelization, which is what makes things crisp.
Because the heat needs to get really high.
Yes. The surface of the food needs to get well above the boiling point of water, above 100 degrees C or 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Fat is a much more efficient conductor of heat than air, and it allows the food surface to make even contact with the hot pan.
And it helps get rid of moisture.
Critically, fat allows the surface water in the food to evaporate very quickly. You need a dry surface for those browning reactions to happen. If the surface stays wet, you get steaming, not searing. Fat ensures rapid surface dehydration, leading to that beautiful, golden brown, flavorful crust.
Which is why you need enough fat in the pan, and you can't overcrowd it.
Precisely. Not enough fat or too much food lowers the temperature, water releases, and poof, steam food.
Okay, so that's crispness. What about the opposite end of the spectrum, creaminess? That's where emulsions come in.
Yes, emulsions. That alchemical wonder, the temporary peace treaty between fat and water.
Yeah.
Things like mayonnaise, hollandaise, vinaigrettes, even butter and ice cream are emulsions.
How do they work? How do you get oil and water, which famously don't mix, to come together?
You need three things: fat, a water-based liquid, and an emulsifier. The emulsifier is the key molecule that has one end attracted to water and the other end attracted to fat. It acts like a bridge.
Like lecithin in egg yolks for mayonnaise.
Exactly. When you make mayonnaise, you have the egg yolk, which contains water, and the emulsifier lecithin, and you slowly whisk in the oil. The whisking breaks the oil into tiny droplets, and the lecithin molecules surround these droplets, preventing them from clumping back together and separating from the water in the yolk.
Creating that thick, creamy, unified sauce.
Right. It's a stable-ish suspension of tiny fat droplets within a water-based liquid held together by the emulsifier.
But sometimes they break. The peace treaty fails.
It happens. Usually because you added the fat too quickly or the temperature was off, too hot or too cold, the emulsion splits back into oil and liquid.
Can you fix it?
Often, yes. First, stop adding fat. Try whisking vigorously. Sometimes that's enough. If not, Samin suggests regulating the temperature, maybe adding a tiny splash of cold water or even an ice chip and whisking that in. Or start over with a fresh egg yolk and slowly whisk the broken emulsion back into the new yolk.
Good tips. Okay, fat and baking. It creates both tenderness and flakiness. How does it do both?
It depends on the state of the fat and how it interacts with the flour. For tenderness, like in muffins, biscuits, or oil-based cakes, you typically use liquid or very soft fat, melted butter, oil, cream.
What does that do?
That soft fat coats the flour proteins very quickly and thoroughly. This coating acts as a barrier, preventing the proteins from linking up easily with water to form long, strong gluten strands. Less gluten means a more tender, crumbly texture.
Okay, so soft fat, less gluten, tenderness. What about flakiness, like in pie crust or puff pastry?
Flakiness requires the opposite approach. You need to keep the fat, usually butter, cold and solid, and in distinct pieces not fully blended in.
Why cold?
Because butter itself is an emulsion. It's about 15–20% water trapped within the butter fat. If that butter melts before the pastry goes into the oven, the water releases, hydrates the flour, and encourages gluten development. Result: tough, chewy pastry.
Ah. So you need the butter to stay solid until it hits the hot oven.
Exactly. You keep the butter cold and create layers or chunks of it within the dough. When that cold dough hits a hot oven, the butter melts rapidly and the water inside it instantly turns to steam. That steam physically pushes the layers of dough apart, creating those coveted flaky layers.
So temperature control is absolutely crucial for pastry.
Non-negotiable. Chill the dough, work quickly, use a hot oven.
There's one more baking technique involving fat. Creaming, like for butter cakes. What's happening there?
Creaming is about aeration. You take cool but not cold room temperature butter and beat it thoroughly with sugar. The sharp edges of the sugar crystals physically cut into the butter.
Why? What does that cutting do?
It creates thousands of microscopic air pockets within the butter-sugar mixture. These trapped air bubbles are a primary source of leavening in creamed cakes, contributing to a fine, velvety crumb.
So again, temperature matters. Butter can't be too cold or too warm.
Right. If the butter's too cold, it's too hard to incorporate air effectively. If it's too warm and melty, its emulsion structure breaks down, and it can't hold on to the air bubbles. You need that just right, pliable, cool room temperature.
Fascinating how much physics is involved. Lastly, on fat. Samin talks about layering different fats.
Yeah, using multiple types or forms of fat in one dish to build complexity. It's not just about the main cooking fat.
Give me an example.
Okay, maybe you sear fish in clarified butter, which has a high smoke point. But then you finish the dish with a sauce made with whole butter for its richer flavor and creamy texture. Two forms of butter fat doing different jobs.
Or savory examples.
Like we mentioned, maybe using bacon fat on the waffle iron for crispness, but having melted butter in the batter itself for richness. Or pairing a naturally fatty ingredient like avocado with a flavored oil, like an agrumato, and olive oil pressed with citrus fruit, adding a bright aromatic layer on top of the creamy fat.
Building layers of flavor using different fats. I like it. Okay, that brings us smoothly to our third element, acid. Acid, the brightener, the balancer. Samin argues it's just as fundamental as salt, but works differently.
How so? You said salt has an absolute threshold, enough or not enough, but acid is relative.
Exactly. Acid balance is all about contrast and perception. The classic example she uses is lemonade.
Right. Lemon juice and water alone is just sour. Painfully sour.
But you add sugar. Does the sugar magically make the lemon juice less acidic? Does it change the pH?
No, I guess not. The acidity level is the same.
Right, but the sweetness provides a counterbalance to the sourness, making the overall drink palatable and refreshing. The acid is still there, doing its job, but the sugar makes it enjoyable. That's relative balance.
So acid needs to be balanced against other tastes.
Precisely. It provides essential contrast to saltiness, richness, fat, sweetness, bitterness, and even starchiness. It cuts through, cleanses the palate, and makes flavors pop.
Her big light bulb moment for acid came with a soup at Chez Panisse.
Yes, a simple, velvety pureed vegetable soup. She seasoned it perfectly with salt, thought it was fresh, really elegant.
But the chef, Russ, told her to add something else.
He told her, add a capful of vinegar to the pot before you bring it up. Just a tiny amount.
She must have thought he was crazy. Vinegar in a delicate soup.
She was totally skeptical. She pictured this, weird sweet and sour thing happening.
That wasn't the result.
Not at all. The tiny amount of vinegar didn't make the soup taste sour or vinegary. Instead, she said it acted like a prism.
A prism?
Yeah, like it suddenly refracted the soup's flavors, making all the individual components, the butter, the specific vegetable, the nuance of the stock, taste clearer, brighter, more distinct. It wasn't adding a new flavor so much as illuminating the ones already there.
Wow, that's a powerful description. It wakes everything up.
Exactly. And you see this principle everywhere in global cuisine. Iconic dishes are often defined by their acidic components.
Like what?
Think British fish and chips needs that sharp malt vinegar. Mexican carnitas tacos cry out for bright, acidic salsa or a squeeze of lime. Chinese soup dumplings, xiao longbao dipped in that tangy black vinegar. The acid cuts the richness and makes the whole thing sing.
It makes me think of Thanksgiving dinner again.
Her cranberry sauce realization. It hit her that on many traditional Thanksgiving plates, the cranberry sauce is often the only significant source of acidity.
Which explains why people load it onto the turkey, the stuffing, the potatoes.
Because everything else is rich, savory, fatty, starchy. Your palate is craving that bright, acidic contrast to cut through it all and bring the meal back to life. Cranberry sauce isn't just a side dish. It's performing a crucial balancing act.
Okay, acid doesn't just affect flavor, it affects texture and color too, right? Chemically.
Oh, definitely. Let's start with color. Acid has a pronounced effect on pigments, especially in vegetables. It tends to dull green vegetables.
So adding lemon juice or vinaigrette to cooked spinach or green beans makes them turn that less appealing olive green.
Yep. Chlorophyll, the green pigment, is sensitive to acid. That's why you should dress green salads right before serving or add lemon juice to cooked greens at the very last second.
But it works differently for reds and purples.
It does the opposite. Acid actually helps preserve and brighten red and purple pigments, anthocyanins. Think about cooking red cabbage. Adding vinegar or apples, which are acidic, helps keep it vibrantly purple instead of turning a murky blue-gray.
And it stops browning in fruits.
Right. A little lemon juice on sliced apples or avocados prevents oxidation, keeping them looking fresh. That's acid-inhibiting enzymatic browning.
Okay, what about texture? How does acid affect how vegetables cook?
This is a really important one. Acid strengthens cellulose and pectin, the structural components in plant cell walls. It makes them tougher and slows down the cooking process.
So if you add acidic ingredients too early?
The vegetables might never get fully tender. Her example is adding tomatoes or wine to a stew before the onions, carrots, and celery are completely soft. The acid hits them, firms up their structure, and they might just stay slightly crunchy, floating stubbornly on top.
The takeaway being, cook your base vegetables until tender first, then add the acid.
Absolutely. Get the texture right, then introduce the tomatoes, wine, vinegar, lemon juice, whatever the recipe calls for. Sequence matters.
And acid affects protein texture, too. You mentioned ceviche.
Right. Acid denatures proteins, similar to heat. In ceviche, the citric acid from lime or lemon juice unfolds the proteins in the raw fish, causing them to tangle up and coagulate, turning the fish firm and opaque, essentially cooking it without heat.
Does it tenderize meat in marinades?
It does, initially. Acid helps break down some surface proteins and connective tissues, but if left too long, the acid can actually start to cook the surface, making it mushy or tough. So acidic marinades are usually best for shorter periods. However, in slow cooking,
Like braising tough cuts.
yes, there the gentle heat and the acidity, often from wine, tomatoes, or vinegar in the braising liquid, work together over a long time to break down tough collagen into lush, melt-in-your-mouth gelatin. Acid encourages that transformation.
So using acid effectively often means layering different types.
Totally. Just like layering fats. Using multiple sources of acidity adds complexity. The classic Caesar salad is a perfect example.
How so?
It gets acidity from several places, the sharpness of wine vinegar, the bright tang of lemon juice, but also the subtle lactic acid and umami from the Parmesan cheese, and even a hint from the Worcestershire sauce, which often contains tamarind and vinegar. It's a chorus of different acidic notes.
You could also layer vinegars like balsamic and red wine vinegar.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe use balsamic for its deep syrupy notes, but spike it with a splash of red wine vinegar for a sharper edge. Or combine the mellow acidity of rice vinegar with the dieselizing of fresh lime juice in an Asian-inspired dressing. Play with combinations.
And always balance sweetness with acid.
Always. Think about roasted root vegetables like beets or carrots, which get quite sweet when cooked. A final drizzle of balsamic or sherry vinegar cuts that sweetness beautifully and adds dimension. Sweet and sour is a fundamental pairing for a reason.
Okay, this feels like a good spot for that active participation challenge you mentioned.
Yes. Let's challenge you, our listeners. Think about a dish you make regularly that sometimes feels a bit heavy, or maybe muddy, or just dull. Could be a stew, a soup, a pasta sauce, anything.
The next time you make it, right at the very end, before serving, take out a small portion, taste it. Then add just a tiny drop, literally a drop or two of good quality vinegar like sherry or red wine or fresh lemon juice. Stir it in, taste it again.
See if you experience that prism effect Samin described. Does it suddenly taste brighter? Do the individual flavors seem more defined? Just notice the difference. It's a small action with potentially big results.
Great challenge. Okay, we've covered salt, fat, acid. That leaves the final element, heat.
Heat, the invisible force, the transformer. Samin's big insight here came from observing cooks all over the world.
And what did she notice?
She noticed the best cooks, regardless of culture or equipment, weren't staring at the thermometer or the stove dial. They were looking at the food.
They were reading the cues the food was giving them.
Exactly. They were using their senses, listening for the sizzle, watching for the browning, feeling the texture change with a prod, smelling the aromas develop. Those sensory cues told them more about what was happening than any timer or temperature setting.
It's that jazz musician analogy again, learning to improvise based on real-time feedback.
Right. Recognizing the signals. Is it browning too fast? Is it shrinking? Is it firming up? Is one side cooking more than the other? Is it releasing moisture? Those observations are key to controlling heat effectively.
And the starting temperature of the food itself is really important too.
Hugely important, especially for things like meat, eggs, dairy. Food straight from the fridge behaves very differently when it hits heat compared to food that's at room temperature.
Like searing a steak.
Perfect example. A fridge-cold steak hitting a hot pan. The outside starts cooking aggressively, while the inside is still ice-cold. You often end up with a burnt exterior and a raw middle. Letting it come towards room temp first allows for much more even cooking.
Heat also affects how things taste and smell, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It governs volatility, the tendency of aromatic molecules to evaporate and travel to your nose.
So warm food literally releases more aroma.
Much more. Think about bread baking or those warm chocolate chip cookies versus cold cookie dough. The heat makes those delicious volatile compounds evaporate, creating that inviting smell, which is a huge part of flavor perception.
Does it change how we perceive tastes too?
Yes. Our taste receptors work differently at different temperatures. Generally, sweet, bitter, and umami tastes are perceived as more intense when food is warmer.
Like cheese tasting better at room temperature.
Exactly. Cold cheese tastes muted because the fat molecules are tight, trapping the flavor compounds. As it warms up, the fats relax, releasing those compounds, and suddenly you taste all the complexity. Conversely, bitterness is often less pronounced when things are colder. Think about ice-cold beer versus room temp beer.
Okay, let's break down the application of heat. Samin distinguishes between gentle heat and intense heat.
Right. Gentle heat includes methods like simmering, poaching, steaming, and confit. This is generally used for delicate foods that would fall apart under high heat, or for tough cuts of meat that need long, slow cooking.
Like poaching eggs or fish.
Perfect examples. Gentle heat cooks them through without toughening them. And for tough cuts like brisket or pork shoulder, slow, moist heat, braising or stewing, is essential to gradually break down collagen into gelatin, making the meat tender.
Samin had a realization about simmering versus boiling.
Yes, she realized a full, rolling boil, 100 degrees C, 212 degrees F, is actually quite violent and often unnecessary, even detrimental. Simmering, where the water is just below boiling, around 82 degrees C, 96 degrees C, or 180 degrees F, 205 degrees F, with just a few gentle bubbles rising, is much kinder.
Why is simmering better?
It prevents delicate things like beans, pieces of meat in a stew, polenta, even some sauces from getting jostled around and breaking apart. It cooks more evenly and gently. A rolling boil should be the exception, reserved mainly for cooking pasta or blanching some vegetables quickly.
And confit falls under gentle heat, too.
Absolutely. Confit is basically poaching, but using fat instead of water is the medium, usually at a moderate temperature, like 120 degrees, 150 degrees, or 250 degrees F, 300 degrees air. The fat surrounds the food, often duck, chicken, or even tuna, cooks it gently, prevents moisture loss, and results in incredibly tender, flavorful food.
The goal here is usually rapid cooking and significant surface browning that Maillard reaction again. And the keys to success with intense heat.
Preheat, preheat, preheat. Preheat the pan, preheat the oven, preheat the oil. You need that initial blast of high heat to start the searing process immediately.
And don't overcrowd the pan.
The cardinal sin. Samin tells that story of loading a baking sheet with sliced zucchini. Instead of roasting, it just turned into a sopping, soggy mess swimming in zucchini juice.
Because the food released too much moisture and cooled the pan down.
Exactly. It switched from roasting, dry heat, to steaming, moist heat. You need space for the hot air or fat to circulate around each piece. Work in batches if you have to.
What happens if the heat isn't intense enough, like when frying?
If the oil isn't hot enough when the food goes in, the food just sits there and absorbs oil instead of immediately forming a crust. Result: greasy, heavy, pale food. Think soggy French fries or oily fried chicken. You need that instant sizzle.
Heat also interacts differently with sugars and starches, right? Like toasting bread.
Yeah, toast is a great microexample. How you apply heat depends on the bread structure and what you want to achieve.
So thin sandwich bread versus thick sourdough.
For thin slices, Samin suggests a more moderate heat, like 180 degrees C, 350 degrees air. This allows it to brown and crisp evenly without completely drying out into a cracker. But for a thick slice of dense, moist sourdough, you can crank the heat higher, maybe 230 degrees C, 450 degrees air, to get a quick, dark crust while keeping the inside soft and chewy. You're managing moisture evaporation.
And potatoes, new versus old.
This is fascinating. Vegetables generally get sweeter as heat breaks down complex starches into simple sugars. But newly harvested potatoes are naturally higher in sugar. If you try to deep fry these sugary potatoes, the sugars caramelize too quickly and burn before the inside is cooked.
So older potatoes are better for fries.
Yes, because much of the sugar is converted to starch. They brown more slowly and evenly. But you need to rinse sliced, starchy potatoes thoroughly in cold water to remove excess surface starch, otherwise they can stick together and get gummy. Rinse until the water runs clear, then dry them well before frying for the best results.
One last heat interaction. Pectin in fruit. For jams.
Right. Pectin is a natural fiber in fruits, especially abundant in things like apples, citrus peels, and quince. It's what makes jams and jellies set. But pectin needs help.
What does it need?
It needs sugar, acid, and heat. The heat helps extract the pectin from the fruit, and then, in the presence of the right amount of sugar and acid, the pectin molecules form a gel network as the mixture cools. That's how you get jam instead of just fruit syrup. Samin even learned the old-school British way of boiling seeds and membranes in a pouch to extract extra pectin power.
Amazing. Okay, we've covered the 4 elements individually. Now, how do we bring it all together? The philosophy part.
This is where it all connects. Samin argues that food with truly universal appeal almost always strikes a delicious balance between salt, fat, and acid. SFA. Heat is the facilitator, but that SFA triad is what our palates intrinsically crave.
Why do we crave that combo?
Evolution, probably. Our bodies need sources of salt and fat, and acid often signals ripeness or helps preserve food. Think about globally loved dishes. Pizza margherita, salty cheese crust, fatty cheese oil, acidic tomato. Caesar salad, salty cheese anchovy, fatty dressing croutons, acidic lemon vinegar. Thai curries, salty fish sauce, fatty coconut milk, acidic lime, they all hit those notes.
So the goal in cooking is to consciously balance those 3.
Yes, and to balance what she calls cleanliness and depth. Cleanliness comes from brighter flavors, citrus, fresh herbs, less intense cooking. Depth comes from rich stocks, umami ingredients, aggressive browning, long cooking. You want an interplay between the two.
This understanding helps with planning meals, too. The idea of menu anchoring.
Exactly. Instead of staring blankly at the fridge, you anchor your meal around one core decision. The anchor could be a specific ingredient you want to highlight, like, I perfectly salted this chicken for 2 days. The meal revolves around that.
Or it could be a method.
Right. Tonight, everything is coming off the grill. That dictates what else you make. Or, crucially, the anchor can be a constraint. I only have one working oven burner for the party. That forces you to choose dishes that work around that limitation, maybe some room temp salads, something braised ahead of time. SFAH helps you navigate constraints creatively.
That links to ingredient quality. Samin learned this early on at Chez Panisse in her garde-manger role.
The eating guard.
Yeah.
Yeah, her job was literally to inventory and taste everything that came into the kitchen before the chefs wrote the menu.
What did that teach her?
The fundamental truth. You cannot fix bad ingredients with technique. No amount of perfectly balanced salt, fat, acid, and heat can make up for tired, out-of-season produce or subpar meat. Freshness and quality are paramount. Start with good stuff.
And if you can't get great fresh stuff...
Her tip is brilliant. Don't discount the freezer aisle. Frozen fruits and vegetables are often picked at their peak ripeness and flash frozen within hours, locking in nutrients and flavor. They can often be much better than fresh produce that's traveled thousands of miles and sat on a shelf for a week.
Good practical advice. Okay, final big idea. The role of recipes. Samin has a strong take on this.
She does. She quotes her mentor, Judy Rogers of Zuni Cafe, saying, "Recipes do not make food taste good, people do."
Meaning?
Meaning recipes are roadmaps, suggestions, starting points, not immutable laws. There are too many variables in cooking: the exact acidity of your tomato, the size of your carrots, the actual heat output of your stove, the humidity in your kitchen. Conditions are never exactly the same twice.
So you can't just follow the steps blindly and expect perfection.
No. You have to engage your senses, use your judgment, taste constantly, and adjust based on what's actually happening in your pan.
Yeah.
You need to use curiosity as an essential ingredient. Understand the principles behind the steps. Why am I searing this? Why add acid now? Once you know the why, you can adapt the how.
That brings us back full circle to the main idea.
Yep. The dorimi of cooking. Salt, fat, acid, heat are the fundamental notes. Once you know the notes to sing, Samin says, you can sing most anything. It's about moving from imitation, following recipes, to improvisation, understanding principles.
It really demystifies cooking, doesn't it? It's not magic. It's understanding these 4 elements and how they interact.
Absolutely. It's choreography. Knowing when to amplify with salt, when to enrich and carry with fat, when to brighten and contrast with acid, and how to transform with heat. That's the art.
So let's issue that final challenge again. We really want you, listening right now, to take these ideas from the book and actively apply them this week.
Pick something you're cooking. Anything, simple or complex. As you cook, consciously think, how's the salt? Does it need more or maybe a different kind of saltiness? How's the fat? Could it use a finishing drizzle of oil? Or is it rich enough? Does it need acid? A squeeze of lemon, a splash of vinegar to cut the richness? Is the heat right for what I'm trying to achieve?
Engage with the process using these 4 lenses. See how it changes your cooking and your results.
And if this discussion has piqued your interest, if you want to truly master these concepts, you absolutely should get the book. Go out and purchase Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, Mastering the Elements of Good Cooking hardcover by Samin Nosrat. It's beautifully written, wonderfully illustrated, and packed with more detail than we could ever cover here.
Read it, cook from it, Let it change your kitchen life. And maybe even engage with Samin Nosrat on social media. She's often sharing insights and continuing the conversation. Keep learning.
It really is a foundational text for any home cook wanting to move beyond just following instructions.
Well, this has been an incredibly flavorful deep dive. Thank you so much for exploring these elements with us.
Thank you for joining us on the Plain Books podcast. We hope this inspires you in the kitchen.
Please follow, subscribe, and share this podcast with anyone else who loves food, loves learning, and wants to become a more confident, intuitive cook. Until next time.